Okay. So just to summarize where we're at, we are going through the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We spoke about the beginning of the day. Now we're in the section that speaks about prayer. And within prayer, I divided the chapters into three general sections: preparing for davening, the holiness of the shul and the base medrash, and finally, the sections of the davening, which we are running through. We started with Pesukei de Zimra, the verses of song. And now we have moved on to we're about to go on to section number 2, which is the Shema. And before we get there, we start taking a moment to stop and talk about saying Kaddish, barchu, and the importance of a minyan, because it's at this point that the minyan is necessary. And we've gone through the first couple of sections. We spoke about what we just mentioned, that it's from that point that a minyan is required, how old the participants need to be, how to count people. A nice thought, by the way, is one of the verses that I used is Hashia es amecha ovarech es nachlasecha urei v'naseim ata eilam, 10 words. And that Hashia es amecha actually means save your people. So as we're counting our people, we're turning to Hashem and we're saying, Hashem, please save your people, take us out of this exile and bring us to the redemption. So that's a little verse on how we count people in a positive way, the importance of the original 10 people being in the room. And then we are in the middle of learning about the actual recital of Kaddish itself. And we started off by speaking about, or we went through how sorry, something's wrong with here. Okay. So we spoke about the importance of listening to the Kaddish, answering with concentration, the power of how Amen Yehesh Me Rabbah has the ability to nullify a terrible decree, how it should be said with great figure, but not too loud to make others laugh at you, because then you'd be at fault for putting a stumbling block in front of them to make them sin by laughing at you. And about that final word, Yisparich. Just before we move on to the 6th halacha, we speak about whether you stand or sit for Kaddish, and a few additional points that I came across regarding the Kaddish itself, which I found quite interesting. So firstly, as far as Kaddish, the Shulchan Aruch says that one should try to have at least 7 Kaddishim a day. And that corresponds to the verse that says that we say to Hashem says that, or we say to Hashem, 7 times a day I will praise you. When we say Kaddish, we're praising Hashem. So the Shulchan Aruch says, at a minimum, one should try to say the Kaddish 7 times, or answer to the Kaddish 7 times, which would include 3 times in the morning prayers, 1 by barchu, when we conclude the verses of song, once after the Amidah, which is a mitzvah in its own right, and 1 after saying Oval Tzion, where we say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So that's the 3 minimal Kaddishim required in the morning. This is if there was no morning presence. It's basically the 3 junctures. Each Kaddish divides the davening. So a Kaddish is a junction between one section of the davening and the next. So we'd say 1 Kaddish between the verses of the song and the Shema, the 2nd Kaddish after the Amidah, and the 3rd Kaddish pretty much at the end of davening just before Aleinu. A 4th and 5th Kaddish would come by Mincha time, 1 after Ashrei, because there's great value in saying Ashrei in its own right. So just when we finish the Ashrei, you think you're just starting Mincha, you've actually just finished an important part of the day. Because we mentioned, the Gemara says in Brachos that anybody who says Ashrei 3 times a day merits the world to come. And by saying Ashrei that 3rd time when we daven Mincha, so just after Ashrei alone, we already make Kaddish, having concluded the Ashrei prayer. And then we say Kaddish a 2nd time after the Amidah. And in the evening prayers, we say Kaddish 2 more times, once after the blessings of the Shema. The reason for that is actually quite interesting. Once upon a time, people were very afraid to be out at night, and so the minyan would actually end before the Shemona Esrei. They would come to the minyan just to say barchu in the Shema, and then they would go home and daven Ma'ariv when they got home, or there would be an abbreviated Ma'ariv. So that's why there's a Kaddish before already. We say the Amidah, because that's when the minyan would end at some point, and then a second Kaddish after the Amidah. So if you're keeping track, that's a total of 7 Kaddishim per day. 3 in the morning, 2 by Mincha, and 2 by Ma'ariv. However, other sources say that one should try to have at least 10 Kaddishim a day. The Zohar actually says one should try to have at least 10 Kaddishim a day, and that would include an additional 3 Kaddishim after Aleinu by Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, which is recited by the mourner. Okay, maybe too many numbers for this late in the day, but it's just quite interesting that there's a whole discussion of exactly how many Kaddishes minimum should be recited on a daily basis. Okay, so now let's move on to what do we do when we hear Kaddish? Do we sit or do we stand? So he says some authorities maintain that you are not required to stand during Kaddish. But if you are already standing when Kaddish is to be said, for instance, after Hallel, then you should remain standing until after Amen Yehei Shmei Rabbah. Others hold the opinion that you should always stand during Kaddish, as well as during other prayers of holiness. And there's a Kal V'chomer, which is we learn from one case to another case. If regarding Eglon, the king of Moab, it is written that when Ehud came to him, Ehud said, I have brought you a word of God, at which point Eglon stood up, the king, from his throne, and he was an idol worshiper, and nonetheless he stood up to hear the word of Hashem. How much more so should we, who are Hashem's people, stand when we talk about praising Hashem? Nonetheless, both of these opinions are brought in the earlier commentary, in the early authorities, and for that reason, in some communities, it is the custom for people to stand for people to sit during Kaddish. In some communities, it is the custom for people to stand during Kaddish. And another opinion, quite interestingly, is in the original Shulchan Aruch, it doesn't say one should stand during Kaddish. It says one should stand when answering Kaddish. So in some communities, actually, the congregants just stand while they say Amen and while they say Yehei Shmei Rabbah, because their understanding is that the requirement is to stand when you respond, but not necessarily when you hear. So it's good to know there's no right or wrong, rather different customs, each having their sources in the early Rishonim, in the early commentaries. So that's whether you stand or sit, and the Shulchan Aruch does conclude it's preferable to stand. Okay, now as far as how many people need to be present when Kaddish is recited, so you would gather at this point that you need a minyan, which is at least 10 people. But what happens if not all of the other 9 people are able to answer Amen? Is that a problem or is that not a problem? So the Shulchan Aruch says like this: if there are not 9 men listening to the Chazan, you should not say Kaddish at all. Because as we've said, a holy prayer needs to be said with 10 people, no less. 1 person saying it and 9 people listening. However, if one of the 10 is in the middle of the Amidah, this is something very practical, I'll discuss it in a moment, then although he cannot respond with them, for we will learn that when a person is in the middle of Shemona Esrei, he is not allowed to even answer Amen. He may be counted in the 10. The same applies to 2, 3, or 4 who are in Shemona Esrei. As long as there is a majority responding, then the response of the minority is not a necessity. However, if one of them is asleep, he should be awakened, because one who is sleeping cannot be counted in the 10. So let me discuss all of that. So firstly, the place that this is most relevant, we're not talking now about the repetition of the Amidah. We're talking about Kaddish. There's a distinction. I'm not going to get into why there's a distinction over here. Maybe I'll explain it when we come up to the repetition of the Amidah. But as far as Kaddish is concerned, there's a... So we're saying you need to have 10 people in the room, and not all 9 people need to be able to answer. This is relevant by Ma'ariv, by the evening prayers, because there's a Kaddish straight after the Amidah, by the evening prayers. By Shachris and Mincha, there's the repetition of the Amidah, and for the repetition, you do need to have 9 people that are able to answer. But by Ma'ariv, where there is no repetition of the Amidah, but rather we go straight into Kaddish, so what this means, practically speaking, is that if some of the congregants are still davening Shmoneh Esrei, the Chazan may proceed to say Kaddish, even though he will not have 9 people answering him, because whoever is still in the middle of the Shmoneh Esrei will be unable to answer. That's not a problem. Why? Because even though those that are in the middle of the Shmoneh Esrei are not able to answer, that holiness of a quorum of 10 people is still present. And as long as you have that holiness of 10 people, Kaddish can be recited. Even if they don't answer.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So are you saying there's actually 2 requirements? There's not 2 requirements, but could it be either or? That if 10 men respond that it is acceptable, or 10 men physically being in the room?
Yeah, so what we're saying is that even if nobody responds, Kaddish could still be recited. He actually says a majority should be able to respond. So as long as you have 6 people that can respond, Kaddish can be recited, even if the other 4 are not responding. Because just the fact that they're in the room already creates that holiness. But just before you move on to your question, I wanted to clarify the last point, because I might answer it. He says if one of them is asleep, he should be wakened. So this is the abbreviation of the original Shulchan Aruch. The original Shulchan Aruch actually has quite a discussion about somebody who's sleeping. And the 2 sides of it is, either you say that the fact that he's there means that he brings that holiness of 10 people, even though he's sleeping, or we say that while he's sleeping, his neshama is actually not there. His neshama is in heaven. When a person sleeps, it's like a 60th of death. And so therefore, once he's asleep, you've lost that power of 10 people. So there are different opinions that are brought, and the Shulchan Aruch says, so therefore, since according to some opinions it's a problematic, just go ahead and wake him, because then you'll resolve the issue. So that's the discussion about somebody who's sleeping. But back to you, Mark.
So where I'm going with this is, if it is acceptable that 10 men respond to Kaddish, how can we not be using virtual minyanim then?
Very good. That's a great question. So there's 2 points to the answer. Firstly, what we're saying over here is that what makes the minyan isn't whether they respond. What makes the minyan is the 10 neshamas being in one physical space. Like we learned earlier, even if you're in 2 rooms in the same shul, if you have 8 people in the room and 2 guys in the foyer, even though the guys in the foyer can hear you loud and clear, you cannot say Kaddish, because you need to have the 10 people in the same physical space. That's what makes the holiness. In addition, you should also have them answering Amen. So answering Amen isn't what makes the holiness. I would say that's the addition. But what makes the holiness is the physical presence of 10 Jews together.
But in an extreme circumstance, could one utilize that? Clearly not, I would imagine, because we're not doing it. Correct.
But now you understand why not. The reason is because you simply do not have 10 neshamas in one space.
Okay, but so let me pose another question to you. Sorry, I'm taking up your time.
That's good.
So all this came about was obviously when I went on my trip to Poland. Okay, and ideally, what I wanted to be able to do was, when I was at the camp, I wanted to be able to say Kaddish, but I couldn't say Kaddish because I needed 9 other men. So the question that I'm asking is, and I mean, you're talking about in the middle of Poland, there wasn't probably a Jew for, I don't know, 100 kilometers from where I was standing. In that extreme circumstances, could it be allowed or still not?
Let me try to give an analogy to answer your question. Okay. So I may stand to be correct with my analogy, but this is just what came to mind. So let's say, you need a light in your bedroom because your lights stopped working for whatever reason, they're gone, or you never had a light. And if you ask an electrician, in order to install a lamp or light in your room, you need to have wires that are, I don't know if there's any electricians here, but they need to be a certain thickness, the actual wires, in order to be able to bring power to your lamp. So you go into your cupboard and you don't have a thick cord which follows the criteria for a light. But what you do have is the thin cords, which are good for doorbells, which are basically carrying a voltage of maybe 6 or 12 volts. So you'll say that what I'll do is it's going to work. I'll wire up, I'll connect my bell cord, which is extremely thin, which is made for 12 volts. I'll connect it to the central power, and I'll connect my light bulb, and it's going to work. The light will turn on. So the reason it's not a good analogy is because although the light will still turn on, you're obviously in serious danger because the whole cord may melt. But in this scenario, when we say Kaddish, we're bringing down holiness, we're bringing Hashem down into this world. And the only way we could achieve that light to shine in the room is if we have the power of a minyan. If we don't have the power of the minyan, there are many wonderful things that we could do, but the particular energy of Kaddish is something that needs to be powered by a minyan. And if you don't have the minyan, then the words, they're not powered. So it's like having the light fixture, but the cord is short. If the cord is short, you can have the fanciest light fixture, but it's not going to give you the light. And we're saying, if you don't have the minyan for the Kaddish, you have the words, but the words become like an empty vehicle because you don't have the power of the minyan to draw the godly light into them. That's that analogy that comes to mind. I don't know if it helps understand, perhaps.
All right. So I've got one last question. Sorry, gentlemen. Okay. So we're saying every brocha there's never a waste in doing any mitzvah, any brocha, right?
Correct.
Well, if one happens,
a bracha actually has to be. There are conditions for a bracha, but continue with your question.
So I don't know what category Kaddish falls into. But if one does say Kaddish and you don't have a minyan, in your opinion, is it a waste?
I think that not only is it a waste, but it's a little bit of a disrespect, because it's like going ahead and showing off your light fixture when it doesn't have power. It's like now nobody's going to want to buy that light fixture. They're going to think it's okay. That's not a good analogy. But the point that I'm saying is that Kaddish has a certain dynamics that it needs to function. And if you don't have those dynamics in place, then not only are you not achieving what the Kaddish would achieve, but I think that it's actually. So I would discourage it in light of what we've been discussing. There's a second point, though, which is talking about Zoom minyanim, which is, once you're already asking, I'll touch upon it, because I see that perhaps tomorrow we'll continue with barchu in section number 8. And that is, there's a whole discussion whether, when we're on a Zoom meeting now, you're not hearing my voice. You're hearing a machine that is duplicating my voice. So in theory, if I was, in shul and saying I was in shul and I was, let's say, saying Kaddish because I'm chazan, and you can't hear me because you live 2 blocks down the road, but you had one person every 30 meters, and as soon as and then you got each person repeated what the other person said. So would you say that you could answer Amen because you're hearing the chazan, because the guy 30 meters down the road, he's repeating it and he's repeating it? In other words, you'd say obviously not, because you're not hearing the chazan, you're hearing somebody else. So the big discussion is whether when you hear a bracha or a kaddish or anything through Zoom, are you hearing an electronic reproduction, or are you hearing the original? And as far as I understand, the general consensus is you are allowed to answer Amen, even though you're listening to a machine, which is interesting. But nonetheless, I think it would be agreed. Here's an interesting scenario. Let's say you were all in the same space, okay, and you could all see each other, but you can't hear each other because you have noise-canceling earphones. So you're hearing the sound through your earphones, but you're not hearing the people. So then you're in the same space. Would you be allowed to answer Amen to the electronic reproduction? That would be an interesting question. But I just wanted to mention there's a second point to bear in mind, which is that when on Zoom, you're not hearing the original, you're hearing a brilliant reproduction of it, which is another huge discussion in contemporary halacha. We'll end with this. Thanks for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Yosef.